some of the points might not be completely accurate, but the contributors will correct me. The other glitch that I'm facing is my printer went in the blink yet again. I'm getting a new one from work next week sometime, and so I'm actually reading off this iPad mini. I tried it once before, it was a disaster. Maybe today it'll be a little better, but here we go. First of all, I want to express some thanks. I want to thank Ron Dixon, our Treasurer, who's done really great work over the past year in getting our finances into good order. And in particular, I want to thank this woman here, Jean Anderson, our Secretary, who brings her wonderful organisational skills to events like this, who's just told me that the mic isn't switched on. But there we go, that's Jean for you. And I want to thank the team from Independence Live who are covering the event today, so that the audience will be much bigger than the audience we have in here this morning and this afternoon. SNP CND itself is a section of Scottish CND. In other words, when people join Scottish CND and they are a member of the SNP, if they've got an SNP membership card and they join Scottish CND, they automatically become a member of SNP CND. Some people think we're a subsection of the party. Actually, technically we're not, but we're treated as such, which is good. And if the party did otherwise, we'd moan and kick and scream and all the rest of it. So we are definitely very much in with the DNA of the Scottish National Party, though formally part of Scottish CND. The purpose of today, in a sense, is to provide a space where members of the SNP, non-members of the SNP who support independence, because since the first referendum was called, the political discourse in Scotland has blossomed. I was about to use Chairman Mao's flower bloom, but maybe that's not appropriate given the current government of China. But there is a wider, we have a wider discourse. And so in a sense you've got the wider peace movement, many of who overwhelmingly support independence, and you've got folk like our esteemed parliamentarian, Douglas, at the other end, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, who's down there in the lion's den. And this is to try and give a space where the likes of Douglas can come and talk to you, and we can talk to Douglas, and also have a wider discussion. That's the sort of rationale behind SNP CND and the events that we actually hold. Today, what we want to try and start to focus on is a roadmap for removal of Trident, and to start building upon that. We'll have some other events around the roadmap in a bit more detail, but today is sort of a wider context, because what we're going to look at is a bit about Scotland's place in the world, and then from that we then look at the roadmap which we'll actually come up with. Douglas, who's going to be giving his address in a few minutes' time, is one of the members of the SNP defence team. He shadows the UK government's defence team, and I think the area that Douglas shadows specifically is procurement, though Douglas' interest is much wider than just the procurement issues. You can listen to his contributions in various media forms, and Douglas is going to say make some wider comments. He is the Member of Parliament for Dunfermline West Fife, which of course contains the Rosyth Dockyard, which of course in an independent Scotland would probably be, I think we'd probably agree, would be one of the key pieces of Scotland's defence infrastructure. Now, again, sorry, I'm using some of my notes here. The roadmap itself, I'm going to say just a few words about that. Basically what we've got at the moment is we've got two pillars or two foundations to work on. One of them is John Ainsley's work on removing Trident, which is peer reviewed. We've got some copies up there, and I mean peer reviewed by members of the nuclear defence establishment. who see John's work as credible. And the other one is a relatively recent manifestation, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was passed in the United Nations last July, actually, with a growing number of countries that are signing up to it. I think there's around about 70. Those two foundations are probably, I would guess, be the basis of that roadmap that we'll work towards for the second independence referendum. After Douglas, we're going to have two contributions, one from Stuart Crawford, and Stuart himself has been a consistent commentator on Scotland's security context and Scotland's security issues in the context of an independent Scotland. Douglas has been writing on these issues for some time. I remember at the time of the first referendum, in my view, he produced one of the best papers of the lot, or the Blue Bonnets, and he's done an update of that. Now, there's one or two things that you'll hear this morning that probably are a bit controversial and we might not necessarily agree with over his timescale, say, of trident removal. But the point about it is this: Stuart has actually started to talk about a timescale for trident removal. So on the one hand, you've got Stuart's work, you've got the late John Ainsley's work, and that provides a basis to again talk about that trident removal programme, and I think that really is quite important. Stuart's done an update on his Other Blue Bonnets paper, and he's going to say a bit about that. The other speaker that you'll be hearing from in the session after Douglas is Gary MacDonald. Gary did a paper for Commonweal on the defence and security issues of an independent Scotland. At the moment, he's a policy analyst, and his current work is focusing on cyber resilience, and of course that's an area that feeds into the whole nuclear dimension as well. The organisation BASIC have done some work on how recent developments in cyber are sort of upending the concept of deterrence. Personally, I don't think the concept of nuclear deterrence adds up anyway, but the BASIC work suggests even if you did believe in deterrence, then the unknowns that the new cyber context brings in makes that even more problematic. And as I say, Stuart is going to say about that. Later on this afternoon, Robin McAlpin, who's out having a cup of coffee at the moment, is going to take these issues that we're going to be discussing and put them in the context of the next independence referendum. I mean, one of the questions I'm going to be asking this afternoon is, to put it very basically, to give a bit of focus, if we were going to produce a leaflet on these issues, what would it look like? I mean, how does these discourses, some of which is quite technical, how do they fit in with public perceptions? And Robin, because of his professional work before he became director of Commonweal, and actually the work that Commonweal is doing at the moment, a lot of that work is about how the public perceive the independence issue, particularly what Robin will probably talk about as the soft no voters, and how all of this fits into the paradigm of the second independence referendum that I'm assuming we're going to have at some point in the not too distant. But there's also, how's the time, Jean? Running out. I've got 1 minute. Right. And another aspect which I think we shouldn't forget about is the current context. Because if we're talking about an independent Scotland and the future of an independent Scotland without Trident, there is the current UK context which we see as dysfunctional. We who believe in independence think the British state is somewhat dysfunctional, and with Brexit, with dysfunctional with spades. And there are some issues around there in relation to the UK that we can actually comment on as well. I mean, the most ludicrous example, I suppose, is the fact they're building 2 big aircraft carriers, and the aircraft are going to be provided by the United States Marine Corps. I mean, if you're talking about Imperial Auxiliary, it doesn't get more stark than that. They're going to have 2 big, huge aircraft carriers. I don't agree with them. I don't think they're necessary, even in the British context. But the actual air wings are going to be provided by the United States. That in itself says a lot about Britain's place in the world. But at that, I'll say no more, and I'm going to hand over to Douglas, and I'm going to say a bit about Isabel as well. Isabel Lindsay is going to be one of the moderators and chairs today. I'm going to say something about Isabel, which I think is really important, and it's seeing things in a bigger context. I know I'm overrunning my time just a minute, but I want to say this thing about Isabel. The modern SNP came into existence in the 1960s, and it came into existence because at that time a number of young socialist, social democratic activists joined the Scottish National Party and turned it into the modern political party that it is today. It says in the membership card, a social democratic party. And the reason that's like that is because of people like Isabel. And one of the aspects of that was taking the social democratic line, but also, crucially, actually for the SNP, its anti-nuclear position, which it's had. It runs in the veins of the SNP. And Isabel and people like Isabel played a pivotal role in turning the SNP into the party it is today. And she brings to this discussion today a wide experience of not only the independence movement, but the anti-nuclear movement in Scotland since its inception, when it first kicked off in the 1960s with the Polaris campaign. So I'll hand over to Isabel and to Douglas. Isabel.
Well, as you know, Douglas is MP and is defence spokesperson, and I think we have to have some sympathy for him, because for an anti-nuclear activist, it's quite a lonely place. And ironically, it has in recent years become a lonelier place. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, but it used to be that there were people like Jeremy Corbyn and John MacDonald and a whole group of people like that. You could always depend on getting support on any anti-nuclear issue or many of the anti-war issues. But unfortunately, that has all changed. Yeah. Not, to be fair, because they have changed their position, but because of the party structures that they are involved in and tied into. So we're now in a situation where the people who were considered to be the big hope by many on the left throughout the UK, and certainly some of those in the Labour left in Scotland, turn out to be confirming the position. They will go ahead with Trident renewal, and there is absolutely no question of, in their future manifesto, the removal of nuclear weapons from Britain. So I think that tells us something about the necessary route ahead. Douglas.
Thanks very much. It's always best to try and get your technology working before you actually make a start, but I'm not sure if that's...
Right, there you are.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, good morning, and thanks to SNP CND for the invitation to come and speak this morning. I think it augurs well for the future that we have so many people in the party in Scotland who want to see a nuclear-free Scotland, and that's certainly part of our real push that we have within our defence team at Westminster. And I was just reminded as I was coming in, actually, because I had a wee look in the hall downstairs, and I was thinking about the number of national councils and the number of national assemblies and conferences that had been held at these very halls. And I remember one, I'm not sure if it was Isabel or not, but I think Alex Salmon was in the chair once upon a time, and Isabel was waxing lyrically, and the red light came on to tell her to, that's your time up, you need to get off now. And Isabel turned around and said, I'm trying as hard as I can to get to the end. And Alex Salmon dryly said, try harder. So hopefully, if I'm talking for too long today, you might want to tell me to try harder just to get finished. But we'll take you through a short presentation anyway, and we can have a discussion when that follows. And obviously we've got two excellent speakers in terms of Stuart and Gary as well today. So I think there's going to be a lot of food for thought. Just on the title, I've been part of the defence team since I got elected in 2015, to Westminster when we had all our big number of MPs returned. And I've been thinking about a sort of a line that we could be using really to think about how we, how does Scotland present ourselves in a more, hopefully, a nuclear-free, more peaceable world when the world seems to be going in precisely the opposite direction. So I've come up with how we position ourselves in terms of protecting what we have here at home, strong defences, resilient defences, but at the same time, can we play a part in nuclear disarmament? Can we play a part in creating stability in other parts of the world where people are, quite honestly, in a state where either the state has put them in that position where their lives are unstable, and that instability leads to violence. And what would be our role in a modern world that Scotland would take her part in as an independent country? So some of the work we've been doing, just to give you a bit of a background, is that we looked at the white paper that was produced for the 2014 referendum, and I think we've moved on a bit since then, because what we've moved on from is saying, do we just take what the UK are prepared to give us, or is it 10% of the defence that already exists? How do we actually work that out? And I think what we've tried to do is move on to what does Scotland actually need? What's the capability that we need as a small Northern European nation, perhaps part of the EU, perhaps not, but our policy is to be part of the EU, perhaps part of NATO, for example, which again is part of policy. So how does an independent Scotland protect itself in the future, and what do we need to do to build that confidence in our own country? We did some commissioning of work to see, to go back to the basics. What are the risks and threats that face Scotland as a small, independent, Northern European country? And some of the things that came out were, it's unlikely that we'd probably be invaded by another country, another nation, state on state, warfare and anything like that. It's probably unlikely that we'd be sending lots and lots of troops to fight elsewhere in the world. Maybe our focus would be on things like peacekeeping and that kind of role, as opposed to an open warfare kind of aggressive role. And some of the threats that did come out of that were that probably faced more threat from things like organised crime, more threat from cyber attacks on our country. And I mean, Gary's, I think, more of the expert than I am on all that. But I mean, if somebody came in and wanted to disrupt society in Scotland, they would maybe attack our electricity system or our water system, or the way that people move around the country, maybe the rail system or something like that. It wouldn't be people crossing the border or coming in from the north on ships or anything like that. It would be more the civil aspects of how you disrupt a society. So that's part of where our thinking is just now. And also, if there is going to be any push, then it would probably come from Russia, maybe the high north. And again, how do we protect ourselves in that sphere? And the other big one that is on everybody's agenda is issues with the environment, climate change, and the impact that might have on society. Is that another big disruptor of the society that we live in? If we have massive change in our climate cycle during the year. And the other thing, the last thing that's on the slide there, is the early days of a new nation. One of the great things we've had since 2015 is the ability to speak to people that SNP people have never had a chance to speak to before, or certainly not in the depth that we've tried to carry out over the last few years. And this was something that was raised by when we spoke to a wide range of ambassadors, but one of the ambassadors we spoke to was from Ukraine, and she was saying that the big thing about Ukraine is they knew they had this big neighbour on their doorstep, but the relationship had always been fairly respectful until Russia decided to start doing things on their border that has put us in the position that Ukraine sits just now. And I think that what they were saying is that in the early days of their independence, which wasn't that long ago, they were maybe I'll not use the word naive, but they didn't expect some of the things to happen that have happened in the last few years. So as an independent country, as Scotland's in that position, then what are the things that we need to get into place very early on to secure our borders, our sea, and to make sure that we're in a position to, so as soon as you guys vote yes in INDIREF 2, then we know what the plan is to actually safeguard our own nation in these early years, and maybe 1 to 5 years of our existence as a nation. We've also looked as well, we went to various countries, and we've spoken to a wide range of different defence attaches across London, and that's, again, it's the benefit of having a big team at Westminster, that we get actually time to go and have these discussions. And a lot of countries, small countries like ours, work on a total defence concept. So it starts with every citizen in terms of your responsibility as a citizen, and making sure that your town, your street, your village, whatever it is, that you feel safe within that environment. And that, in a lot of countries, obviously police and more local intelligence services are of importance. But we want to take it a step further to think about how we develop our foreign affairs team, international development, international trade and defence, how that can mesh together actually to be a real joined up approach to how we present ourselves, not just here at home but abroad as well. So I think what we find at Westminster, and I don't want to keep using that as an example, because we've got an opportunity to start with almost like a clean sheet of paper. But you often find that a lot of departments at Westminster are vying for the same budget, or they're up against each other. And what we are trying to get to is a position where we're actually working hand in glove with all the other agencies and departments within Scotland to see if we can actually strengthen our defences that way by everybody working together. And I think the other big thing that we learned from Norway, for example, is that they brought in and the industry and academia as well, the university sector, to actually strengthen the case across all these different aspects of how we provide total defence for our nation. Norway is, some of the defence exports I think are currently just on the rise in Norway, but again, if we work smarter and maybe have defence procurement that actually prevents people killing each other or injuring each other, and use the new technologies more smartly. We've got the talents in Scotland that can develop that whole sector that encourages people to maybe live in a more peaceable way in the future without resorting to violence or guns or armaments. That basically, the map you see there, basically is our bread and butter area. It's our economic zone is the yellow line. So everything on land and sea and airspace within that is Scotland's. That's our bread and butter area, and it's the same way as Norwegians think. They've got a similar map as well that said, whatever happens in the world, this is our core area that we need to protect and defend. And to take it onto a wider spectrum, again, a lot of the discussion we've been having within the defence team is about, if we were members of NATO, for example, then what would we bring to the NATO table? We wouldn't bring, or we wouldn't want to bring nuclear weapons. We wouldn't want to bring Faslane, because our plan is that is taken off the table. But what could we bring to NATO in these circumstances? And the defence of the Greenland, Iceland, Scotland gap is something, and moving into the Arctic, for example, that's an area that we could actually say to NATO, this is our area that we're prepared to protect. How do you support us in doing that? So the other one is about the moving on to peace and stability abroad, and we are working on the assumption that we are members of the EU, working on assumption that we be members of the UN, and with a special focus on peace building and peacekeeping. Our NATO, as was just said, with the Greenland, Iceland, Scotland gap, in NATO terms, that would be our sphere of influence. You know, we're not looking at in the Middle East, we're not looking at the Far East as being part of our remit. It's closer to home, much more manageable. And also we've done quite a lot of work in terms of the Arctic Council. And while we wouldn't be members of the Arctic Council, we might be observer members of the Arctic Council. And that whole area, just in terms of the not just defence, but also environmental issues around that area, again, Scotland could play a large role in making sure that you know, we could hold our heads high in terms of protecting that area and working with our Arctic neighbours to actually create a better environment. The last two on there are the bilateral agreements that we'd have with other countries, and I suppose part of that as well would be what is left to the UK once we leave. But the UK have got some assets that I think might be of value to Scotland as well. We've got a very good training centre, officer training centre at Shrivenham, who are providing expert backup in terms of how to deal with some of the cyber threats, for example, and also things like joining or trying to join the Five Eyes group, which is an information intelligence sharing group which covers the UK, I think Australia, New Zealand, and I've probably forgotten the other two countries, but
USA and Canada.
USA and Canada, right? Okay, thank you, Stuart. So whether that would become Six Eyes, I don't know, but I think there's an opportunity there for Scotland to play its part, and also things like our own intelligence services in terms of Interpol and making a contribution to that. We already have what would be the equivalent of our intelligence centre at Gartcosh through Police Scotland, and again that just takes everything back down to the basic level of civil society as opposed to high level military intervention or high level military action. And for today, again, the big thing is what you want to talk about is Trident, I suppose, and we agree with some of the work that needs to be done in terms of the roadmap that would take us from where we are just now as part of the UK and being a nuclear state. How do we actually move that from there to being non-nuclear and a much more defence resilient country, but nevertheless a much more peaceable country in terms of our general outlook. At the moment, Trident is hugely expensive and hugely expensive for the UK. I mean, every other budget that exists within the defence budget is being skewed to pay for Trident. So, anybody who's in the Ministry of Defence behind a desk at the moment must know that we can't find the capability within the Army, Navy or Air Force. We can't do the things they want to do because so much of the budget is skewed towards this one project that, quite honestly, we know the technology is outdated. Bill was talking about who owns all this, and it's not owned or controlled by the UK. It's controlled by the USA. And anytime they do testing, and I'm trying to get out to one of the future tests as well. But we know what happened the last time when the missile headed towards Florida, and I think there was a fair old panic happening that day. Luckily there wasn't a warhead on it. But the point is that we are stuck with this hugely expensive, probably not very effective weapon system that we know as an independent Scotland. We need to move out of fast lane. The question is, how do we best do that? And it's very easy for people to stand up at a conference and say, nuclear weapons off the Clyde, nuclear weapons off the Clyde, great. But what I think we need to do is have the confidence to say, and this is how we're going to do it. So that's part of the discussion that we need to trigger today, I think, and make sure that we're all joined up in terms of how we get there. But we have got to think about how that affects our relations with other countries. I'm sure that there'll be other NATO states, for example, if we're seeking membership, for example, there'll be NATO states who don't particularly like the fact that we're trying to get rid of nuclear weapons on the Clyde. But I think it's how we present what the alternatives are to that in terms of deterrence, because all deterrence is not nuclear. You can have deterrence in different ways. So how do we actually provide that level of deterrence in the North Atlantic, going into the Arctic, and making sure that people understand that that is our bread and butter, that is our reason for having a defence force, is to protect that, our country in that area. I'll just say one thing as well, just about the submarine dismantling at Rosyth. The first stages are being considered just now, and how we actually take apart some of the 7 boats that are in water, being stored in water at Rosyth at the moment. I'm working with the Labour MP for Devonport, and what we're doing just now is to try and see if we can have this process accelerated. So once the 7 boats are out of Rosyth and broken up, and the nuclear waste, the residual nuclear waste is taken away, then we're again starting with a blank canvas in terms of what Rosyth can do, and we're not taking up valuable berthing space for keeping old nuclear powered submarines. So that's work that's ongoing as well. So we can see there's a number of strands there that we're working on. Just watch my time. One of the things that Carol Monaghan's working on, who's one of our defence team, Carol's MP in Glasgow, is about the quality of life for our service personnel. We'll be, again, looking at different models, and like Denmark, for example, is very good in terms of how they support our people who are serving in the armed forces, or would be in our peacekeeping forces, for example. And I think we all know as well, it's really difficult to recruit into the services just now. So how do we actually look at that and the terms and conditions, if you like, of service that we would offer Scottish personnel in these circumstances? I just note, I think Colonel Ruth Davidson was brought in as someone who was going to boost the numbers of serving personnel in Scotland. And unfortunately, when you look at the graph, it's actually going in the opposite direction. So I don't think it's personal. I don't think people have looked at Ruth and thought, I'm not joining. But it's probably the pressure of motherhood have probably taken over from being a colonel role. Also, Carol's done quite a bit of work as well, just and Martin Dockley-Hughes, to be honest, on developing a role where the armed forces, they might not have a trade union, but they might have something like the equivalent of the police federation. So if they had a concern, for example, then that could be taken up through that federation. So it just gives them an extra bit of sort of leverage, if you like, to actually speak to their employers on a more level playing field. And it seems a bit fairer than just simply following the orders that they're given at the moment. And you can see from the article that's there, I was on the Defence Committee for a couple of years, and we fought to have a drug that the UK were using called Lariam, which was an anti-malarial drug, and it was proved time and time again that this drug had really serious detrimental effects to soldiers' mental health. You know, it made them become more violent, more agitated. You know, they couldn't sleep at nights and things like that if they'd been given this drug. So we fought through the Defence Select Committee to have this drug taken off the list of what soldiers would get, and they would just get it in their. You know, if they were going on manoeuvres, for example, or on operations, they would just get it as part of their pack that they would get when they left the country, with no instructions, no detail about, you know, the side effects that this might have. So again, I think we need something like the equivalent of police federation, you know, services federation, if you call it that, so that at least serving personnel have got the ability to tell or explain to their employers that something is sadly awry here, and obviously when it comes to paying conditions as well, then it gives them a bit of leverage in terms of what they can do. In terms of UK, again, things like housing and after-service care are pretty horrendous thing for lots of people serving in the forces. You know, the housing has been slated, you know, for probably the best part of the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the poor quality, the lack of maintenance, and quite honestly, you know, if you're an employer, you've got a duty of care, just in the same way as Larian, you've got a duty of care to your employee, and I think the same thing should be for people who are serving in our forces, maybe our peacekeepers abroad, and making sure that they're in a much better place, and we actually try to look after anybody who's serving the country in that role. Some of the things we have been doing as well, just as a team, is just this basically intelligence gathering. So it's been everything from looking at, you know, the assets that the UK has, making as much noise as we can about things that actually don't work very well within the UK. You know, there's 6. At one point there were 6 Type 45 destroyers sitting in the dock down at Portsmouth, and you know, these ships cost £1 billion each, so that's £6 billion worth of asset sitting there doing nothing. And you know, we just try and keep these things to the fore as well. There's not very good value for the taxpayer. We've been out, and that's on the border of Norway and Russia. So we've done some visits abroad as well, and it's amazing, there's the information that you can pick up on these things. And again, it's about information gathering, intelligence gathering, so we can actually understand the landscape that is around us across Europe. The ship on the right, that's in Odessa, and part of the Ukrainian Navy there. So you get an idea of what other countries actually have in terms of how they defend their own country. And as I say, we're getting access to people and places that we've never had before, so that should stand us in good stead. One on the left is a Defence Committee visit to Norway, and the other one was, the 2 on the right hand side, is actually the front line between Ukraine, a part of Ukraine, Crimea, that's been annexed by Russia. So again, every night, 7 o'clock, these flats are fired on. You know, like big missiles come over, and you can virtually time them to 7 o'clock every night. Come over from the sort of Russian side of the border, and quite honestly, there's people still living in the flats, but they've nowhere else to go, so to remain basically in situ. But I mean, it's experiences like that as well that sort of given us a wider range of experiences and examples. You don't need to see these ones. We have been working as well quite closely with Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and some of the Baltic states as well. So there's a lot of discussion going on just now, mainly offline. Some countries are more helpful than others, but there are people in various embassies and defence attaches in London who have been very helpful in terms of, if you were designing your armed forces in Scotland, then why not do this or why not do that? So it's been very, very useful from that point of view. Just very quickly, just on the peace agenda as well, being a Dunfermline boy, one of the great sons of Dunfermline is Andrew Carnegie, and while he made billions of pounds during his life, the latter part of his life was dedicated to creating peace, and he tried to build this peace palace, you can see here, in The Hague, to try and avert the First World War taking place at all. And here we are, 100 years on, looking at the 100 years on from all these people being killed during that time. So peace is, I think, is going to be an increasing area of our activity. I just returned from a Carnegie Peace Conference in The Hague, having lots of discussions with people across Europe there as well, and working as hard as we can in all the various forums that we managed to get into now. Even it's been discussed in NATO, and also for example, we've been pushing for a long time for the NATO-Russia Council to be re-established, and I think this year alone they've had 2 meetings. So at least Russia and NATO are back together, at least talking about things, and that's where we really want them to be. Very quickly on procurement, post-independence, I still think that the rest of the UK will require the shipyards on the Clyde and possibly at Rosyth as well to actually build what they want to build. They just don't have the capability elsewhere in the UK to take on the contracts for Type 31s, the sports ships, or anything else. So we have the assets here, the infrastructure here to allow us to do that, and I think just in the same way as there's a period of transition that we'll experience, I think, as we leave the EU, I think there'll be a period of transition as well as we leave the UK, and it could be that the part of our leaving deal, if you like, is to continue to build some of these ships until we move on to something that's a bit more, much more of a defence diversification programme for Scotland, so we can actually move away from some of the defence issues in the future, and maybe use all these skills and talents of the engineers to actually do something that's a bit more positive for the world. I'll just say quickly as well, the Lossiemouth again is going to be quite a big hub in terms of the P8s, which are the maritime patrol aircraft, and already there's 3 huge hangars being built in Lossiemouth as we speak. One will be for the NATO forces, the NATO P8s, and the other ones will be for the Americans want a hub for themselves as well. So that's already being put into place. And again, from my point of view, that's a really positive thing in that we can maintain an eye in the sky, if you like, over that whole area of the Greenland-Iceland gap and into the Arctic as well. And the other thing, just on that final part of the slide, is about how do we actually move into niche areas that are actually going to make the world more stable. And I think there's things like infield medicine, for example, that Scotland can become an expert nation in. We've already got quite a big space and satellite industry in Scotland, and again, that's another niche area I think we could move into in terms of what can we offer our partners and allies across the world. I'm sure Stuart will talk more about the actual nuts and bolts of where we are, but I think these will be assets that we'll continue to have. There's Bedford Barracks in Edinburgh, Lossiemouth that we've just spoken about, and obviously Faslane, and we need to think about how we move Faslane from where it is as a nuclear facility just now into something that comes back to what we need, what's our capability requirements in the west coast of Scotland. If we have fast jets, probably need to reopen Lookers as a base, and for the east coast, so much of our wealth, renewables, oil and gas, and also if we're looking at there's more and more Arctic cruise ships, for example, and there's not a huge amount of work that's been going into what happens if one of these carrying 3,000 people, what happens if that has an accident? How do we actually go and rescue 3,000 people? And again, Scotland's ideally placed to take on that more peaceable role, should we get the opportunity. And the last one there is Staxaboard, which is UK are currently investing quite a lot in re-establishing a listening station up in Shetland. So again, it's things like that that we can bring to the table to give our partners and allies a bit more confidence in what we can give. And that's it. And I don't know, time-wise, I know we're a late start, but...
Yes. Are you able to stay till
yes.
past? Yes. I wasn't sure you had to
if I can take any questions now.
Well, what we were going to do was to leave questions until the end, well, when I say the end, until about past. So if you can stay till then, okay. That's fine. Our next speaker is Gary Mcallister, who's an independent defence analyst, and Gary did the research work for the Commonweal White Paper project on defence.
So I'll get my phone out, but I'm not tweeting or Snapchat or anything. I've just got my notes on here. Yep, same as before. Thank you very much to the SNP CND team for having me here. As I said, yeah, I wrote the Commonweal paper as part of the White Paper project. Basically, part of the motivation for that was, I think it felt at the time of the last referendum, the case for Scottish independence around the defence and security issues weren't as well formed as they could have been. So you could probably compare that to, say, the currency issue. You know, again, it was one issue I don't think that was quite fully formed at the time. And obviously since then, there's been a lot more development in that space. Broadly speaking today, I was going to give a sort of an overview of some issues that I covered in the paper. Relatively high-level issues, looking at things like capabilities, contingencies, you know, policy, coherence, things like that. So I was going to sort of briefly run through some of those issues, and some of this might cover some of the grounds Douglas has already covered. But if it does, I apologise. So I guess the first thing to say is that, you know, obviously building a new defence and security, you know, strategy for Scotland. You know, you've got all these new institutions that all, in some ways, have to be built from scratch, and you're talking military, intelligence agency, possibly some increased capability for police forces, as well as a host of others. You know, that's a big task, but it's not an impossible one. You know, I think that's the sort of the unionist or better together position will be. It can't be done, can't be done. Whereas history, time and time again, usually proves that wrong. So the first thing I was going to chat about, sorry, it's actually working now. Contingencies. So let's say Scotland right now, you know, is probably very, very secure. It's in a geographically secure place. You know, it's surrounded by benign neighbours, you know, all of whom are democratic countries. You know, it's far removed from unstable regions of the world or anybody who's trying to annex territories. You know, so obviously we're not quite far removed from Eastern Europe. We're quite far removed from the Middle East. And, you know, as Douglas has hinted at, obviously our Scotland's focus would be more regional. You know, you'd be looking at the sort of immediate area as opposed to sort of far-flung power projection elsewhere. You could argue that our most common threats just now, and again, Douglas picked up on this, was, you know, you're talking about cybercrime, you're talking about organised crime, to some degree terrorism. These are all persistent threats that, you know, any country faces, but they're not, I would argue, they're not existential threats. You know, it's one of these things that every country has to live with to some extent. You know, so obviously the likelihood of a major conflict involving Scotland remains low at present. But I guess on that note, the worst guide to the future is often the present, you know, because it essentially assumes that what we have now is what we're always going to have. And there's certainly quite a few trends just now that are probably disconcerting to a lot of people, that hints that the world's perhaps entering a phase of increased geopolitical instability. So you're talking about, obviously you've got climate change, resource depletion, you've got obviously a resurgence of the far right in many countries. These are all things that are, you know, obviously troubling, and we can't say for certain that if they're going to turn into something more insidious, like actual conflict on the European continent. But that's something we're uncertain of. Like anyone who says it's impossible, you know, I think that's a bit of hubris, to be honest. None of us know what's going to happen in the future. So what I would say is that, you know, it's not something that you count as the big threat that's, you know, if people are out to get us, but it's something that you make sure you maintain capabilities to guard against. And that means you have to have some sort of level of flexibility within your defence and security strategy. I mean, you're not just, you know, focusing on one threat at the expense of others. So what I would say that in terms of capabilities to counter these kind of things, so if what we're seeing is cybercrime, organised crime, terrorism, if these are your most common threats, then that means that's where the majority of your investment should go into, in terms of, you know, meet what's actually causing threats just now. So, you know, obviously you've got like human trafficking, illicit goods, you know, these things have a real impact in human lives, but also at the same time a very significant impact on the national revenue base, which will also be a very significant part of the early days of independence for Scotland. So obviously curbing these things is quite a significant challenge, and I would say it's the most important issue Scotland should be addressing. But at the same time, that's not saying that you don't need military capabilities. It just means that perhaps you keep them in a smaller state of readiness or in a place where you can reconstitute them if the threat environment changes. So, for example, if there's a massive increase in strategic tensions within Europe, let's say the current trends of polarisation of politics leads to increased competition, increased confrontation, potentially increased conflict. If that creates those sort of situations, there's usually warning signs that allow you to increase your capabilities. So you preserve a capability in a core of capability, and then you grow it essentially to meet whatever the threat is that's presenting itself. And again, tying into what Douglas was saying, there is a need to specialise some of these capabilities, because that allows you to meet your immediate needs. So obviously Scotland's interests are going to be more maritime and air than land power based. So it's going to be more around, how do we protect our fishing grounds, how do you protect your airspace, things like that. That would mean that we're specialising probably in those areas. But at the same time, you can also develop capabilities like intelligence gathering or maritime drones, and obviously these buy you influence within coalition operations. So Scotland's part of a multinational alliance, or it's part of an international operation. Having these specialist capabilities means that you can perhaps sway to some extent how the operation is conducted. Sorry, one second, just scroll into this. Yeah, so as I've said before, obviously with cybercrime and organised crime being one of your main priorities, that probably means you're going to have a law enforcement focus of your defence and security strategy. And I think this is where it's probably arguably a bigger challenge in some ways than developing the military, because at least to some extent, we know how militaries are structured and formed. With an intelligence agency, it's you're getting into very important issues of civil liberties and making sure these agencies have the right powers that they need to obviously detect, disrupt and dismantle organised crime networks. But at the same time, there's obviously in the post-Snowden world, you're talking about enacting legislation that might be quite difficult to do now. So that means replacing the Secret Services Act, the DRIPA, all these other acts which are fairly controversial now. And Scotland would have to sort of essentially develop its own set of legislation effectively to govern how intelligence agencies would work. That to me is probably a bigger challenge in some ways. I would like to see how that turns out. I guess coming back to what I was saying about organised crime in general, so I was talking about human trafficking or smuggling in general. It's something that's very much been neglected, I would argue, by the UK. Obviously they've been very much focused on, we don't have a nice picture of a Vanguard class submarine, but they're obviously focusing on, capabilities which are perhaps, which are very much based on power projection or preserving their place in the world, at the expense of what are actual, modern day threats which are actually undermining genuine security. And I would argue cybercrime to some extent as well. That's very much a growing field. I think that's something that's seriously underestimated in a lot of cases, and it'll probably only be when you have what some people dub a cyber Pearl Harbor, essentially, that people will actually wake up to how big a threat that is. But as again, obviously in the context of Trident, as we've said, it seriously undermines that deterrence case, potentially makes it even more dangerous than it already is. And obviously, in my view, makes it even more obsolete. So, yeah, so those are some key areas to keep an eye on. And I guess, so in terms of the intelligence agency piece, that building an intelligence agency from scratch takes a lot of time, because you're having to actually build trust with essentially your counterpart agencies in other countries, and that's not something that's done easily. This kind of that kind of trust, that currency in international relations takes a long time to build before they'll trust you with secret information or confidential information. So it's definitely something that I would argue is probably better to be starting now, even at a very basic level. You could potentially start to develop some capabilities within Police Scotland to act as a sort of almost a proto-intelligence agency, which could then eventually grow into an independent one in a post-independence environment. So on that note, on the need to sort of have trust and share information with other countries, that's, again, it's obviously a very controversial issue. But unfortunately, a lot of the kind of threats we're talking about, organised crime, terrorism, cybercrime, they're all very transnational in nature. These kind of enterprises use jurisdictional borders or boundaries to evade detection, evade prosecution. Essentially, you need to therefore cooperate across borders, because if they're able to work across borders better than you are with your counterpart agencies, that's a problem. So that's the intelligence sharing piece is very much a fundamental part of it, but it's also, again, as I say, a controversial issue when you're talking about Five Eyes, or you're talking about PRISM or any of these other sort of rather shady programs that the US or the UK are presently involved in. Not that I'm saying that powers aren't necessary. The police, intelligence agencies, they need powers to be able to find these groups and be able to dismantle them. But it's a case of what's the balance. At what point does it become too dragnet or excessively intrusive on the lives of individuals? But in terms of international cooperation, that's you can open it up into a wider conversation. Namely, how does Scotland, through its interactions with other countries, how does it secure its own interests, and how does it contribute to international security? So I guess in that regard, as a small nation, Scotland can't defend itself. Essentially, that's no small nation could, especially against a larger power. Therefore, small nations tend to either form coalitions or they seek the alliance with another power, effectively. That's obviously relatively controversial because it opens up the question of what does Scotland do in relation to NATO. So obviously there's I imagine most people in this room are probably anti-NATO. I think there's probably a question there around, well, put it this way, you wouldn't be able to avoid NATO. So that's not saying that that Scotland would need to be a member of NATO, but given that all your immediate neighbours, Denmark, Norway, UK, are already members, and given that Ireland or any of those countries are members of the Partnership for Peace programme, they're either members or heavily aligned with NATO. So, in terms of things like air defence, you can't avoid it because you need to have the protocols for communicating information, such as, so if there's a hijacked airliner coming in from the north, you need to be able to communicate with Norway, for example. There's a lot of different sort of what they call STANAGs or standardisation agreements that Scotland might have to adopt if it wants to be able to, and you can probably do more in terms of setting your own independent defence policy. There is an argument there as to how far you want to push that, but I think you can't avoid interaction with NATO. That's the thing. I guess it's a case of how do you make sure it's on Scotland's terms, and hopefully we'll unravel more of that as the day goes on. And I guess so we've talked obviously about regional focus. I guess for me, European security in terms of the continent is the same thing as Scottish national security, because Scotland, as I say, Scotland's strategic depth, if you want to call it that, what protects it from all these unstable regions of the world, or what protects it from expansionist powers, is the fact that it's got this big continent in the way, effectively, in a lot of cases. If you have instability on the continent, if you have a return to conflict, then that's obviously a direct threat to Scotland, and therefore Scotland should be well invested in helping, or preventing these sort of things from developing, which means obviously investing in peace and to some extent contributing to international security operations, be that peacekeeping or potentially peace enforcement. And I think that's essentially what would be expected of Scotland. So a lot of these neighbours like Norway or Denmark would probably look to Scotland to offer some degree of continuity in terms of pulling its weight. They would be relying on Scotland to some extent. Obviously, as Douglas pointed out, the GI-UK gap, or as it would be called, the GI-Scotland gap, in a post-independence environment, very significant. In terms of, so the GI-UK gap is, as I say, it's like a maritime choke point, effectively. That's something that's very, very relevant to European security in regards to American reinforcements. So the idea is, if you can defend that gap, you can stop submarines coming from the north, getting into the Atlantic, and preventing American reinforcements from getting into Europe effectively. So it's in many ways seen as like a very vital component of that ability to reinforce Europe. So I think, given that, I think Scotland, that would be a potential negotiating point for Scotland when talking to NATO effectively, would say, right, obviously you want us to play a role in this, what are you going to give us in exchange? What are we, in order for us to align with you on this issue, what are you going to allow, what concession are you going to give? So Scotland will have, it's not as a case of Scotland will have no negotiating or bargaining chips effectively in these situations, but I would say it's careful not to overplay them, but at the same time, don't underplay them. Another matter I would actually argue is really important is policy coherence, and by that I just mean, so let's take an example. So we've got, say, the US and the UK funneling billions and billions into human rights programs, pro-democracy programs, civil society groups, all great stuff, fantastic. Except they're also funneling billions and billions into arms deals and supporting despotic regimes who then suppress those groups. So it's, there's a sort of inherent contradiction there in some ways, I find. I would argue that's, that's obviously something you want to avoid, because if you've got essentially it's left hand not talking to the right hand as I see it. So in independent Scotland, I would say would be much better placed to maybe look at these and have a more joined up policy response, so not just having defence doing its own thing or foreign aid doing its own thing. You have a very coordinated response so that you've got your foreign aid department trying to stop the root causes of instability in the world, combating climate change, combating poverty, things like that. While at the same time you obviously have your military capabilities or your law enforcement capabilities to deal with any threats resulting from those things. So it's not a case of either or. You can't just help the world with just foreign aid. You also need the military and law enforcement aspect as well. But it's about ensuring they're in balance and that they're used in a coordinated way, I would argue. What else have we got here? Yeah, so I think, how am I doing for time anyway?
Just another few minutes.
Another few minutes, okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll say a few statements then. So I guess the important thing for me is, as somebody said to me, we've talked about, we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff in this area. You're talking about war, you're talking about terrorism, you're talking about, some pretty dark things. But the phrase somebody said was, "Dinna be feared," essentially. Largely because what we're talking about here, we're talking about a risk-based approach. We're talking about being prudent and planning. We're not thinking the world's out to get us. It's all about looking at the things logically, looking at what are the actual threats, preparing your capability and development plans accordingly, making sure they're well enough resourced. It's not about pandering to fearmongers or saying like the world's just going to suddenly become this terrible place. It's about just, basically planning well, effectively. And I think there's plenty of people out there who'll tell you the world's on fire, but I would argue, that Scotland's not in any danger right now. So we have this golden opportunity to do things very differently from the UK, to make a far more positive contribution, and I would very much like to see that in my lifetime.
All our three speakers, Gary and Douglas and Stuart, will be open to questions together just after Stuart's finished his contribution. So Stuart's a long-established, again, and coming from a military background, supporter of Scottish independence and analyst on the defence structures in an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Well, good morning everybody, and thank you for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to speak here this morning. I'm delighted to be here, and indeed I'm very flattered, and you'll either be pleased or horrified to know that I've got no technology, so there'll be no slides at all. It's just me. I'd like to start straight away by congratulating Gary on his paper, which was published in December last year, which I've read both in great detail and with great interest. Up until recently, there hasn't been very much written on the topic of how an independent Scotland might go about setting up its armed forces. And I think Gary's paper is a very timely and welcome contribution to the debate. There's, as has been alluded to, and as some of you may know, the particular subject of defending an independent Scotland has been an interest of mine mainly for about the past 20 years or so. And I've written a bit here and there about it, and I've commented it here and there as well. What I will say at the outset, however, is that what I'm going to say this morning will take a much narrower view of defence than Gary's paper does, and that I'll be concentrating mainly on the military aspects and not reflecting overmuch on the wider defence and security strategy that Gary has written about, and indeed Douglas has spoken about earlier this morning. And I'm going to start at a fairly basic level, so please don't be offended if I tell you stuff that you already know. One of the questions that I get asked most frequently when I'm talking to independence-minded folk about military matters is, why do we have any armed forces at all, or why would we need to have any armed forces at all? Why not just stay neutral, rely on some sort of police or gendarmerie arrangement to deal with crime and internal security matters? And the basic premise of this seems to be that if you don't have any armed forces at all, then nobody will want to fight us. Now, that's actually a fair enough question, I think, and I thought I might just start by offering a few thoughts on what armed forces are actually for. I've thought about this quite a bit over the years, and here's where I've got to at the moment, although I have to say that this is only a hypothesis, and it's not my original thought. So first of all, and least popular of all, I would suggest to you that armed forces are required to ensure the survival of the state against internal enemies. They are in effect the state's ultimate argument against non-democratic insurrection and uprising, however unlikely that may appear to be. In addition to this, they of course have a huge utility in tasks with assisting civilian authorities, like helping with disaster relief, ensuring essential services continue during times of crisis, and so on and so forth, and protecting the vulnerable. Secondly, armed forces protect the state from external aggression and act as, and I quote, the political affirmation of sovereignty and identity which results from a visible determination to define and patrol frontiers and areas of interest with military forces. Now clearly this includes policing of airspace, sea routes, and of particular relevance to Scotland, the guarding of oil and gas installations, amongst other things. The third main reason for having armed forces, I would suggest, is to promote stability in regions of the globe where a state has political, economic, or strategic interests. And in this context, much more likely than armed intervention is the achievement of political ends by low-level military assistance, exchange training, military links through attendance at foreign staff colleges, and diplomacy. And there also may well be a need to rescue nationals from an area of conflict or embassy staff in the face of some crisis, again, either unilaterally or in coalition or alliance with others. But apart from these three major aspects, if you accept them or if you don't, the use of armed forces becomes largely a matter of choice, as for example, participation in operations like peace and stability operations, under the auspices of organisations like the UN or indeed NATO. And these can enhance a state's standing in the international community and gain a seat at the conference table when international matters are debated or resolved. And here, of course, the decision to become involved or not would rest with the government of the day and would also most likely be subject to parliamentary approval, although I'll take Douglas's lead on that. So all well and good, you may say, but what the next question might be, in what context would an independent Scotland's armed forces find themselves? In other words, what is independent Scotland's foreign policy focus likely to be? Now, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, any lengthy or detailed statement from anyone on what this foreign policy might look like, apart from a general feeling that we'd like to be everybody's friend and be a good neighbour, which is very commendable in itself. The SNP wants us to remain in the EU, rightly in my sense, and also to join NATO, which is perhaps slightly more contentious, but also I think that that would get my personal approval. And also lots of other things, to ban further arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to stop the conflict in Syria, and so on, all of which are arguably commendable aims. However, it would seem sensible to me, and this has been spoken about already, that an independent Scotland would not wish to continue the global ambitions of the United Kingdom. And so a regional, rather than a worldwide focus, in military terms at least, would be much more likely, which of course has a fairly fundamental impact on how we might go about organising our armed services. Which brings us to the next question, and that is, how do you actually go about designing your armed forces? And most of the commentary on how Scotland might do this has either been via what you might call the comparative approach, looking at what, say, Denmark or New Zealand has, and saying we should have something like that, or by the financially driven model, usually taking a percentage of GDP and saying that'll be the budget, and for that we can buy this, this, and everything else. Now, I don't think that either of those approaches are actually satisfactory. A slightly more scientific approach is called for, I think, anyway. And it's remarkably simple, and it takes place in about three really simple stages. First of all, you have to decide what it is you want your armed forces to do. Second, you have to decide what forces you want to be able to do that. And finally, you have to work out whether you can afford it. And if the answer to question 3 is that you can't afford it, then you start the process all over again. Adjust, compromise, and make do until you can. It's hardly rocket science, and although it may take several iterations of the process, you will get to an acceptable answer. Now, perhaps the most important part of this process is defining what might be the risks and threats that an independent Scotland might want to defend itself against. And let me say straight away that I agree wholeheartedly with Gary when he says in his paper, and I quote verbatim, which proves that I've read it, it is a near certainty that an independent Scotland would face no military threat from any other state, and therefore the threat to Scottish territorial integrity in the near term is extremely low. And I concur with that absolutely. So therefore it follows that the threats and risks for an independent Scotland which might necessitate a military response are therefore of a lower key and different nature. If any threats were to emerge at all, it would seem to be likely to be limited to infringements of airspace and coastal integrity, the security of oil and gas rigs, other economic aspects like fishing grounds, plus threats to our physical and non-physical communication networks, air and sea routes, internet systems, and so on. Now, obviously, terrorism is another threat that we have to be aware of, and that requires a response which is both military and security service led. And to this we need to add the previously mentioned internal risks of undemocratic protest, social unrest and natural disasters. And finally, I would suggest to you that the Scottish Government of the day would at least wish to retain the option to contribute to overseas operations in coalition or in alliance with other states. Now, if you accept that, then we need to ask ourselves what independent Scotland's military might need to have to counter such risks and threats. And no surprise, as an ex-military officer, I believe that we'd probably follow a conventional approach involving naval, army and air force elements, which together might form a Scottish Defence Force. And how they are organised internally is not really here or there at the moment. Now, the central tenets of our previous study, and I say our because Other Blue Bonnets, which you've heard of, was written by me and Richard Marsh, who's an economist who works for the Scottish Government. The central tenets of that were still remain sound 6 years later, and that was specifically that an independent Scotland would be likely to have a regional rather than a global focus, as we've heard before, for its foreign and defence policies, while retaining the option to contribute modestly to international and global interventions, if it so chose. And also that creating and or maintaining a full spectrum military capability would be beyond a relatively small nation of about 5.5 million souls. And accordingly, and we've spoken about this already this morning, military specialisation and niche capability is likely to be the order of the day. And gaps in capability would be filled by membership of NATO and of the emerging EU defence arrangements as they become clearer. So Richard and I, having revisited what we wrote 6 years ago, now envisage a scenario where an independent Scotland would shift its defence and military emphasis away from the army-heavy model that we detailed in 2012, because I don't think that providing infantry troops is any longer Scotland's strongest suit militarily. And that together with an overall reduction in force levels and an even lower budget than that which we used in 2012 of between 1.5 and 1.8 billion pounds per annum. Most, if not all, of Scotland's defence inventory would come from our inherited share, if you like, of the UK's inventory, subject to negotiation, as there are many items which an independent Scotland would neither want nor would be able to afford, in my estimation. So with this in mind, I don't see any utility for high-end weaponry, and therefore have discounted aircraft carriers, submarines, tanks, army attack helicopters, heavy artillery, and perhaps more controversially fast jet attack aircraft. And of course, no nuclear weapons, although the continuing presence or not of the Trident-carrying submarines at Faslane Crowport in the Clyde will be explored in greater detail as we develop our paper, which we're writing at the moment, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And now, just to illustrate, and remembering that this is still a work in progress, in general terms, we now envisage a Scottish Defence Force which comprises a navy of some 20 hulls, maybe 2 frigates, a handful of mine countermeasure vessels and offshore patrol vessels, and some support and training vessels, which would give the navy approximately 2,500 personnel. An army which would be able to produce 1 deployable brigade. A deployable brigade is between 3,000 and 3,500 people, with details of units and equipment which I'm still working on. But a total army presence of about 6,000 altogether, and an air force with approximately 50 either manned aircraft or UAVs, and some 2,000 personnel. So with an allowance given for headquarters and support staff, this gives us a total of about 11,000 personnel, about a third less than our RUSI paper 6 years ago proposed. It would also suggest a ratio of 70 to 30 of regular versus reserve personnel might be appropriate, again subject to further examination. But let me emphasise at this point, this is just our model, it's not the definitive model by any means, and others might have and probably do have better ideas. So can we afford it? Updating the calculations from our 2012 report and using the same methodology, the cost for defending an independent Scotland following our new model would now fall to approximately between 1.1 billion and 1.3 billion pounds per annum. Now you compare this with the Sustainable Growth Commission's report target of defence spending, which looked at 1.6% of GDP, which suggests a defence budget of around 2.7 billion per annum. Now I asked Andrew Wilson where he got this figure from, and he just informed me it was a straight lift from the SNP 2014 white paper. So while it's better than nothing, it's a bit of a stab in the dark still. And Gary's paper has a figure of, I think it's between 1.8 and 2.5 billion per annum, if I've got that correctly. So our new model's costings suggest that defending an independent Scotland could realise savings of up to £2.1 billion each year, compared to both the Growth Commission report and the defence spending allocation to Scotland in the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland figures, GERS. And that is a considerable saving in the initial years of independence, at least. Now this clearly falls short of the NATO minimum defence spending target of 2% of GDP. But Scotland's important geostrategic location and military assets could also be offered as a quid pro quo, or a partial quid pro quo, possibly including development of a NATO or European airbase at Lossiemouth, of which I've written before, or more controversially, leasing Faslane to the remaining UK in the short to medium term. Which brings me neatly to the elephant in the room in any discussion about the defence of an independent Scotland. Faslane and the UK's so-called independent nuclear deterrent. All roads eventually lead to Trident. I think I should take this opportunity to make my personal position on Trident quite clear. I believe that from a moral and ethical standpoint, it is so indiscriminate as a weapons system, sophisticated targeting systems notwithstanding, and is so powerful that huge collateral damage to people and property is unavoidable, and that no civilized country would ever use it. I don't believe that it is truly independent, in that I cannot imagine the UK ever employing it without at least the tacit approval of the USA. Although I also understand, Douglas, that technically it can be used independently in that there is no mechanical or technical way that the providers can interfere with either the missile or its targeting system. But that's maybe for further debate. Certainly, I don't know who it deters. It didn't deter the Argentinians in 1982. It didn't deter the Iraqis in 1990, nor the Taliban, nor Al-Qaeda. And nor do I believe that there's a credible existing nuclear threat to the UK or its interests from so-called rogue states like Iran or North Korea. Now, it may stop the UK being bullied by Russia in the final analysis, but I'm not convinced of this argument either. So I believe that Trident's essentially a political weapon, not a military weapon, whose main function is to maintain the UK in the front rank of global powers and guarantee continuing national membership of the UN Security Council, NATO, etc., etc. A posture which, as you know, has been supported by successive Westminster governments of all hues over the past 50 years plus. Its maintenance and eventual replacement places an enormous burden on the MOD budget and soaks up vast funds which would be far better spent on the UK's conventional forces, more ships for the Royal Navy, for example, better equipment for the Army, better pay and conditions, and better provision for ex-service personnel when they leave the armed forces, which is a particular interest of mine at the moment. So to summarise, I believe Trident is in fact a weapons system which has no conceivable or credible use and is far too costly when other priorities should prevail. I therefore do not believe it should be replaced when it comes to the end of its lifespan by anything similar. However, and here we go controversial, what would an independent Scotland do with its presence on the Clyde when and if independence is achieved? Well, it's highly unlikely, in my opinion, that Trident would vanish from the Clyde the day after a yes vote, no matter how much folk might wish it. I say this for two reasons. The first is that, realistically, there is nowhere else for it to go in the short and medium term, should the remaining UK, as seems likely, wish to retain it. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it could be that Trident on the Clyde would be one of the biggest bargaining chips that an independent Scotland might have. It's limited, and I emphasise limited, continuing presence at Faslane for, say, another 10 years, another 15 years, after independence, could be achieved in exchange for whatever concessions the government of independent Scotland might seek, whether they be financial, economic, military, or whatever. And it might be an acceptable compromise. And we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Faslane Coolport is the second largest single site employer in Scotland, with probably over 11,000 jobs, either directly or indirectly dependent on the broader Royal Navy presence there. And I accept that the number of jobs directly related to Trident presence is probably in the order of 500 to 600. But just to be clear, I don't think there's any argument that Trident should remain on the Clyde in an independent Scotland in the long term. But I do think that possibly the best time for it to be removed is when the current system becomes obsolete and redundant and is about to be replaced by the new dreadnought submarine fleet, whenever that might be, 2035. But that would allow us to prepare for the departure and also allow the rest of the UK, as a compromise, to prepare for somewhere else for it. I think that's probably enough for me at the moment. I hope that's contributed a little bit to today's discussions and might spark some debate. And I'll be happy to take questions on anything that you think too controversial when it comes to the Q&A session. Thank you very much for listening.
How do I stop the feedback? What do I do?
Feedback of the speaker.
Speaker, actually, you switch it off.
Oh, it's too near the speaker.
Yeah, you have to switch the speaker off so we can use that. You either have the speaker or that, one of the two. Just switch off the speaker.
Finding the off switch is not straightforward. Can you all just shout then?
No, we have 15 minutes. I'm sure maybe we can spare another few of the lunch break if there are too many questions for our panel to respond. Brian?
Can I pick up the last point, Stuart? What do we do when we're independent? Try to won't disappear. Of course it won't disappear. It'll be there. If you leave it there, it's tied up. If it's tied up, it's not being deployed. If it's not being deployed, it can't be fired. I'm very much opposed to being any kind of off trading continuing its deployment. I don't want an independent Scot to be complicit in a major war crime, which Trident is an ongoing, actual, real, and existent war crime. That's all.
I'll take a couple of other questions and then.
Yeah, I was a little puzzled because it seems to me that the CND SNP contingent should be thinking about how do you change SNP's policy on NATO, which after all historically has primarily been against NATO. This seems to me what we should be doing is trying to figure out how to build a movement to press the SNP to revert to its original policy of opposing NATO. And I'm not convinced by any of the arguments you made that we should, independent Scotland should be part of NATO. One thing we should be very clear about, Fastlane is used for more than the UK's Trident fleet. It's used by the US Trident fleet. US submarines dock at Fastlane, some of them carrying nuclear weapons. That will continue as long as Scotland is part of NATO. Denmark tried to pull out of it. They were coerced into continuing. There is no country that's part of NATO that does not allow the United States to dock nuclear submarines carrying nuclear weapons. That's part of the deal. That is part of the deal. And in fact, some of the countries in this partnership of peace do the same thing. Sweden in particular has US submarines docking in their ports with nuclear weapons. So we should continue to be opposed to NATO. One further point, you're talking about projecting violence elsewhere. It's not a question of what Scotland is going to do, it's what the United States does. The US projects its power globally, and it uses military bases of NATO countries to do exactly that. So of course it's not a question of Scotland's going to invade Iran to take the country de jure. It's a question of whether the United States will, using NATO bases as jumping off points. That's part of what it means to be part of NATO. There's really, you can't get around it. So I am puzzled why that wasn't part of this agenda. Why is it that we are not talking about changing the SNP's policy back to what it was originally, withdrawn from NATO?
Mentioned that there's no immediate threat to Scotland being invaded. And my question then is, why was the latest NATO exercise, one of the largest they've ever held, a scenario where NATO, the forces involved, were actually invading Norway? So obviously, what they're exercising for is precisely what you're saying would never happen, or might never happen. The other part of that, and it's following on from the previous questioner, is NATO is now increasingly becoming an aggressive alliance. It's not a defensive alliance, it's aggressive. It's building up its forces all over Europe. We've seen it in all the previous Eastern European countries. The so-called defense is being built up. And why we're not talking, thinking about talking as an independent country to Russia, bilateral talks with Russia, instead of this nonsense about always saying Russia as the big bear, the big threat on our borders. It's complete nonsense. And Norway, for example, is investing billions and billions of kroner into Russia because they're worried about the nuclear submarines that are being left there. So we have to look at a way of bringing Russia into an alliance with us, not as the enemy, which is a complete nonsense. Those of you who've met Russians, have been to Russia, know that Russians are some of the friendliest and greatest people in the world. Why we should constantly be thinking of them as our enemy is a complete and utter nonsense. Thank you.
So the issues there, it's obviously a question of NATO, it's a question of the length of time that we would allow before the removal of nuclear weapons, and our relationships with Russia and other countries. Douglas, would you like to go first?
Sure. Let me start with Brian's point. I think all three speakers talked about the potential roadmap that we could start to actually get some meat on the bone of that particular issue about how we can remove nuclear weapons from Faslane. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that. I don't think it's simply an issue about if they're in Faslane then they're not deployed and they're not creating a potential danger. So I think it's how we work together, I think, to get that roadmap worked out. And there may be issues around some of the things that Stuart said, for example, in terms of how do we bring that into post-independence negotiations. But what we are determined to do is, if we have a roadmap, then the sort of the projection that we want to go forward with is based on removing nuclear weapons from Faslane. So that's our starting point. So that would be quite clear in part of these negotiations as well, that that's our end game. So how do we get there as practically and as quickly as we possibly can, as safely as we possibly can during that first period of independence? And I think that's where we should be trying to focus our attention. Just on the issue about NATO, again, I think all three speakers have said, we want to be part of that alliance. I can see certain benefits for Scotland in doing that, because it does give us that strength of defence that if something does go horribly awry that we're not expecting, then NATO nations are there to support of us and be supportive of us if we're a member state. So if there's what's like an Article 5 issue that arose where we were attacked in some way, it's probably low risk, but nevertheless, if we were, then we could rely on our NATO partners to support us in these circumstances. In terms of the SNP current policy is to seek membership of NATO, and certainly if there was people within the party who wanted to take that down a different route, then you've probably got the support of this room in terms of changing that policy, but it's how you convince everybody else to follow suit. And maybe just leave it at that. We can maybe talk later as well, just on some of the detail. Just on, do you want to line? That's the last one as well.
Yes.
Just on the point about the operations in Norway. Norway's stance on NATO and their view of Russia, I think, is that they want a pragmatic relationship with Russia. I mean, we saw pictures of being on the border between Norway and Russia. They have very good relations. People pass on the border every day. I believe that, for example, sort of disposable nappies are exceptionally expensive in Russia. So there's cargoes of disposable nappies that cross the border every day back into Russia because they're a lot cheaper in Norway. But there are good relations in terms of fishing and the different items of trade that go on every day. But what the Norway experience is that they're becoming much more wary, because Russia is proving to be a much more of an unpredictable neighbour. And while they want to maintain that good relationship, as I'm sure Scotland would want to do with Russia, then the difficulty is that Norway are, that Russia is committing things on a daily basis and like pushing the boundaries towards their airspace and things like that, as we experience in the north of Scotland as well. It doesn't mean that Russia are ready to invade, but if their behaviour changed, then we could perhaps take a bit more of a believable stance as far as Russia is concerned. And I'm not anti-Russia at all. You know, I think I've actually pushed when we had a meeting in NATO for the NATO-Russia Council to be re-established, because if you're not speaking to people, then you create a situation where mistakes can be made, where people can misjudge the situation. But if you've got a constant contact with people on, let's say, the other side, then you can actually have that discussion and try and understand each other a bit more. And one of the things that where the UK has failed us is all the intelligence officers that we had working with their Russian counterparts, for example, at the very peak of their career, they were all told, we don't need you anymore. All the people who could speak Russian told, we don't need you anymore, and were pushed out of the MOD, given early retirement, and pushed on to something else. So again, the UK policy has been actually detrimental to our relationship with Russia over the last 5-10 years since the end of the Cold War. And perhaps, while we are not a nation who just sees things through the rose-tinted glasses, but I think that Scotland is uniquely placed as well to develop really good relationships with Russia, and especially through things like the Arctic Council as well. I think these institutions are great opportunities, I think, for us to make that contact, so that the misunderstandings that might happen between two countries might be put on the back burner, and we can actually have a much more positive relationship with each of the countries concerned.
I've actually had dual Norwegian and British citizenship, so I know a bit about Norway and its current politics. And part of the reason for Norway's current stance towards Russia is because they have an extreme right-wing nationalist party as part of the government. So that position has changed in very recent years, and hasn't been the historical position of Norway.
Okay, Gary?
Yeah, so on the Russia side, it's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, no single country should be considered an enemy, I would argue, especially Russia. What you have is multiple countries acting in what they perceive as their own interests. So Russia sees what NATO is doing as aggressive. NATO sees what Russia is doing as aggressive. I think there's a space in there that, looking at these things as a kind of goodies but versus baddies type view is far too simplistic. It's very much around how do you reconcile those competing strategic interests, which are usually rooted in geography. Russia is very paranoid about invasion from the West, largely because it has been invaded from the West several times. Napoleon, Hitler, so on and so forth. So it's very concerned about the North European plain. So it's very much trying to project power into that region, which obviously countries in that region see as aggressive. I would argue that if there is a concern about Russian threats, it's not so much about Russian invasion, but Russian subversion. Use of cyber attacks or disinformation campaigns or things like that to undermine, perhaps, or at least confuse the political landscape in certain countries. So obviously that's been mentioned to some extent in the US as part of the Brexit thing. I guess I would say that they're not the creators of those sort of political conflicts, but they do like to fan the flames a bit, and I think that is arguably a bigger concern. It needs to be addressed, and they're not the only ones. There's plenty of far-right groups in the US that are doing the same thing. But I think that ties very much into the concept of resilience, which we've talked about to a small degree, which is how do you make, so rather than try to be aggressive or try to go out and change the world, how do you make your country more resilient to attacks, be that misinformation campaigns, that kind of thing. How do you make it more resilient to cybercrime? And I think that's arguably more relevant than having an aggressive military posture towards certain countries. On the NATO question, yeah, I mean that was always going to be an involved one here. We're at the SNP CND. I'm not under no illusions that we're going to get lambasted for that one. But my view is relatively sort of in the middle. I don't take the view that NATO is inherently evil, as many people do. But at the same time, I understand that it obviously joining it ties you into certain responsibilities, it ties you into certain, probably American interests to a degree. What I would say though is that, as I've said earlier, avoiding it is impossible because all your neighbours are members, all the neighbours of Scotland are members of it. There has to be some engagement to some extent, if not, that doesn't have to mean condonement, but there has to be at least some degree of cooperation with them, because NATO is, in many ways, it's largely the vessel through which these countries organise their military affairs, organise their defence affairs. So I think it's an issue of how far does Scotland go in terms of engagement, whether that's partnership for peace, whether that's full membership, or whether that's some other form of, more further back, almost not quite disengagement, but at least a very limited level of cooperation. I think in the paper I did argue partnership for peace was probably more relevant, like in comparison to Ireland or whatnot, on the grounds that it does give you a greater degree of flexibility. There is obviously the ever-present issue of coercion, but even if you're not part of NATO, you would still be getting coerced by America because you're occupying a significant bit of strategic real estate within, the West, so the North European high north sort of area, which is obviously of interest to Europe and of interest to America. So those kind of political influences are going to be there regardless, so it's, that's my...
Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, a much more simplistic approach. I mean, I've worked basically on the premise that SNP current policy is that an independent Scotland of the SNP, to form the administration, of course, would seek to join NATO, and that policy was reversed largely through, I think, Angus Robertson's efforts. And the reason that it was reversed, as I understand it from the debate at the time, was because it was seen as being not credible electorally. And that's a view that I probably agreed with at the time. However, that's the current policy, and that's where I'm working from. And indeed, if that policy was to be changed, well, that's very much outside my hands. Why is NATO important? I think there are two basic reasons that NATO is important. First of all, it guarantees US and Canadian involvement in European geopolitical matters, particularly in defence issues. So I think that's hugely important because they are, the USA militarily is still just the only game in town, with China knocking on the door. And secondly, because of Article 5, which Douglas talked about, which basically says attack upon one member is taken as an attack upon all. Now, whether that actually applies to cyber attack, I think has yet to be decided, if that article actually applies. But that's in my opinion, the importance of NATO. Now, sort of taking that onto Faslane, I don't think anyone here supports the idea of nuclear weaponry or being stationed at Faslane. But I attended a conference, 5 years ago, in Oxfordshire called the Ditchley Conferences. And if you look them up, you can see that all the great the good invited to them. I've got no idea why I was there, but I was part of the sort of independentista package that went along to argue the toss. And I had a fairly detailed conversation with the American ambassador to NATO at the time, and his position was quite clear. He said that if, on independence, Scotland were to force the exit of the UK nuclear deterrent from Faslane, then the United States would block Scottish accession to NATO if that's what they wanted. I just throw it in there. So it's, everything is interrelated and interrelated. I can tell you the rest if you want, but not publicly.
Fine. Can I take, because lunch is beckoning, 3 more questions, and remember there's a question and answer session in the afternoon too. There's a discussions, so there will be other opportunities. One to the back, and then you. So if you go first.
I'm just wondering if the Scottish Government's actually taking into account the position of Finland. Because Finland has a hard border with the old Soviet Union and Russia just now, who are not members of NATO and have a completely different defence policy based on a home guard to see any external threat coming into it. I'm just wondering why we're still pandering. I thought we're joining an independent Scotland, a new society, and I want to see a peaceful world. We're just carrying the same flag. It looks like to me we're just having a change of flag and carrying on as per normal. The people out here who vote for independence are looking for a new society, a new country, to have a different say in the world, for a peaceful world. it seems to me we're still pandering on again to, I think a quote from Stuart was, the first role of the army is to defend the state. I thought it was to defend our people, not the state. Yeah, I know it's like this, but it's the proof of the pudding's in the eating, isn't it?
You should join the...
And we're on the stand, why are we on the standing army? Why are we not thinking differently?
Okay, we'll come back to that, thank you.
I'm going to try and be really reductive because I'm a reductive kind of a person, but I mean we're the SNP but also CND. And I think it would be helpful if you stood up, just in terms of SNP and CND, I guess, has a great potential there for a conflict of interest. But in the SNP's primary reason for existence is to get independence for Scotland. And the title of this conference is you know, Scotland post-Trident. Well, you know, if we don't get independence, then everything that's said about post-Trident here today doesn't amount to a hill of beans. So therefore, your priority before Trident, I think, is to get independence. Because if you get independence, then you can do what you need to do about Trident, one way or the other. Whether it's a short-term get riddance or a longer-term phased-in got riddance. But you're not going to do either unless you get independence. And my point, therefore, is it seems to me, speaking to a lot of people, I run an independence hub as well as being a member of an SNP branch. So I speak to people in the public sphere in both senses, both as an SNP representative, as an independence Yes movement representative. And I pick up from a lot of people in the general public that they see a lot of what's said about getting rid of Trident and weapons of mass destruction as being equivalent to almost pacifism. And that ain't a vote winner. If you're going to shift people to vote for independence, you can't tell them that you're going to go for a pacifist, oh, we don't need any army, we don't need any defence structures in Scotland because we're going for a brave new world. Well, that's not going to happen. And you're not going to get the people to shift over to vote for you to be independent. And if they don't do that, you won't be able to do what you want to do about Trident. Because it's not going to happen as long as we're in the UK. You know, to me, there's a conflict going on there that needs to be resolved.
Okay.
Can I home in on the part of the discussion that relates to the Scotland we want to see in the future, and particularly one form of the vulnerability that we've got at the present time, which is the degree of centralisation of our particularly electricity distribution system, and ask a question in relation to what the implications are of the new technologies in the digital age, particularly where you can store energy increasingly cheaply. And the way in which our population is distributed at present in Scotland is very much from the previous industrial era. I'm coming obviously from the perspective of the amount of Scotland that is rural and the potential with energy storage and a decentralisation of our whole approach to energy distribution and its use in terms of the future economy and future security of Scotland, and making it less attractive as an invadable target for whatever potential reason we may not be able to think of at the present time.
Thank you. There was one other person I think wanting to ask a question, so we'll just take one more.
It is, I'd like to challenge the assumption that there is no external immediate threat to an independent future Scotland, because the historical evidence of the UK has been one of the pursuit of partition. The partition is a very, very real threat in an independent Scotland. Firstly, you have it through something like a long-term leasing of Faz Lane, so that it becomes something akin to the Guantanamo base in Cuba, which the Cubans have great difficulty getting rid of. And secondly, it's no accident that the Falkland Islands Legislative Council have held a number of meetings in Orkney and Shetland. Now, this is quite clearly being planned for a future referendum in future, at some time in the future. Now, if the question of sovereignty has to be challenged externally, it will come largely on a sea-based and a nautical type redistribution of territory. And in that sense, I do think that there is a need to have a long look at the question of external threat. I also share the view that NATO is an aggressive alliance. It has moved from being a disciplined organisation to become essentially a pool out of which a coalition of the willing can be manoeuvred. And in that sense, it becomes something that can become a very grave danger, especially because of the geography of Scotland. Secondly, and in respect to the question of sovereignty, I do think not enough knowledge is understood about these so-called partnerships for peace. This is the soft, cuddly version of NATO. It has destroyed the stance of neutrality of countries like the Republic of Ireland, like Finland, like a whole number of, Sweden of course, and has basically brought them into becoming birthing points for nuclear weapons and involvement in those activities. And instead of setting the stance of creating an independent neutral world, it has basically started building up this greater police force. And that is actually where an independent Scotland should be looking.
Now, we haven't got much time, so be as brief as possible. So we've got Finnish defence policy, we've got the question of how acceptable is it to the wider public, the positioning on Trident, and we've got the question to what extent is the rest of the UK a threat, which was never mentioned in terms of something like partition, and there was also something on security and energy security. So it's an awful lot, so you'll just have to take your pick, Douglas.
Right, thanks very much. I think just on the gentleman's point here, and we'll start with that, is I think there is an element of credibility that we need to establish with the people of Scotland. If we went out trying to win a referendum vote saying, well, we won't have any armed forces, I don't think the Yes campaign would last a week in these circumstances. I think what we need are credible ways forward that we can take the country. And you're right, once we're independent, we can decide what the focus of our resilience is going to be, or defence is going to be, and the policies can be developed from that. I think every speaker as well has said that we might start with a very slimmed down defence programme, but as threats emerge or as circumstances change, then we need to adapt to whatever comes our way as a country and as a people. So, I think from that point of view, I think from my point of view, you're on the money in terms of how we win the confidence of people, and if there's changes that we need to make to the way that the country views itself, then that needs to be done after independence to make sure that, because we're never going to achieve that change unless we win that independence. I think one of the slides I put up earlier on was about projecting power, and every time you speak to somebody in the UK Armed Forces, that is their mantra. It's about projecting power worldwide. I don't hold with that. Scotland will not be in that position where that is our raison d'etre. It will be to protect ourselves, and where we can, make a contribution to maybe peacekeeping or peace building elsewhere, and be good global citizens in that respect. But without independence, that line is a pipe dream, because it does not sit with where the UK mentality is on how we defend ourselves as a UK, or how they see themselves as a citizen in the wider world. So we can have something different in Scotland, I think, but independence is the first step. Let's take the people with us and give them something credible to believe in, and then if we can move on from there and become maybe moving towards a nation where we don't need or don't require the level of defence we've got currently, and I think that's a good step.
Okay. Gary?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll pick up briefly on the one about the Finnish model of defence. So they very much embrace the total defence model. There's certainly elements of that I'd like to see in a Scottish defence policy, in terms of the resilience aspect we've talked about, embedding the ability to you know, take a hit and keep going, basically, you know, and recover from disruption, embedding that at various levels of society. And that's very important. But I would also argue they do have some very conventional military structures as well. You know, they have an army, they have an air force, they have the navy. A lot of their defence policy is based on losing territory and being able to prevent the enemy from reaching its core population areas. I don't think that's suitable for Scotland on the grounds that, you know, one, as I've said earlier, I don't believe we're in imminent need of invasion. They share a large they share a land border with a major power. It's more of a relevant aspect to them. I would say Scotland should be more maritime focused on the grounds that it should be about preventing a potential aggressor, be it whoever. I'm not saying Russia, so it could be anybody. You know, potentially from sort of reaching your core areas, your land, basically. Dovetail into that one on the issue of the gentleman at the back saying about potential maritime disputes with the UK. I think that's a possibility. I think there's you know, you've seen it in issues with like the issue with also with the UK and Ireland, and sorry, Iceland. You see it in Spain and Gibraltar. Skirmishes are possible. I don't think the likelihood of all-out war is there, is present. I would say most of if there's going to be battles, they're going to be mostly courtroom battles. And if anything, the UK would probably be more likely to be a partner of Scotland in a lot of issues. Not everything, obviously. You know, that's not the same as saying I would back them up if they went off and invaded Iraq again. It's not the same issue, but we would be relying on cooperating with them to some degree because, well, we're attached to them. You know, they're part of our geography. Geography is fundamental to a lot of how you see defence, and that's for yourself, Jim. I think your question is probably going to be a good one for Robin from Commonweal. He's very much focused on the electoral strategy aspects of, you know, how does this all play into it. But I think he's very much about, you know, you present a hopeful message, not one about fear. You know, 'cause fear will be doing that. They'll be saying, oh no, if they go independent, you'll be invaded, you'll such and such. I think it's about being saying, no, we have a prudent plan. You know, we assess the threats. We have a risk-based approach. You know, we take it logically and not just try and basically say the world's out to get us. I think that's a way to win it. You emphasise the hope rather than the fearful aspects, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Stuart?
Yeah, just a quick couple of points. Again, I agree very much with your point of view. I think, as Bishop Richard Holloway famously said, you shouldn't confuse purpose with process. And it's the end game which is important, and how you get there is probably, arguably, where you might be able to compromise and go down a different route. So I agree absolutely where you're coming from. In just general terms, and I hear the question, why have a standing army and all that sort of stuff, and I think I covered a bit of that, because I think when we talk about armed services, we mustn't solely think of combat operations, because historically combat operations are probably about less than 5% of the way that armed services are utilised. Basically, what you've got under government control are disciplined, trained, cohesive, energetic bodies of men and women who can turn their hand to all sorts of tasks. And I don't mean strike breaking or anything like that, but I'm thinking of the civil disaster thing. For example, who picked up the bodies at Lockerbie after the Panama disaster? It was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Highland Fusiliers, and all these 18-year-old boys, and they were all boys in those days, had that awful task to do, but they were ready, equipped, and biddable to do that sort of stuff on behalf of the government, and therefore, by extension, on behalf of the electorate. So, and if you look at, and I mean, we talk about why have warships and all that sort of stuff. Warships are very useful in disaster relief. Why have medical services? Because humanitarian operations demand it. So I don't think we should think the use of armed forces in combat is the exception rather than the rule. And I just add to that one little analogy, which is quite useful, and I've used it quite a lot, of the way to think about defence. Defence is a bit like your car insurance, you know. You have to have it, but you hope you don't have to use it. I mean, no one pays the car insurance for 11 months and thinks, oh my goodness, I've been paying my insurance for 11 months and I haven't got my money's worth. I better take it out, take the car out and wrap it around a tree and get my money's worth. Well, it's the same with defence. And and taking the analogy further, you can have third-party fire and theft, or you can have fully comprehensive. And you can break down the comprehensive into all the excesses for the sort of risks you want to take. And the sort of model that I was coming up with was very much third-party fire and theft. It wasn't third-party, because I think that's very, very thin. Nor was it fully comprehensive, because then you're into sort of global domination and force projection. But it's quite a good analogy to think you need to have defence, in my opinion, but you hope against hope that you don't want to use it. And I've been to war. It wasn't very exciting, it wasn't very dangerous, but I've done it. And it's hugely wasteful, both spiritually, financially and economically. And you want to avoid that. But without armed services, I think you risk the danger of being bullied into situations which politically and from a people's point of view you wouldn't want to have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can I suggest that we resume, the programme does say 2:30, can I suggest that we try and resume at 2:15?
Can I say a few words about the logistics? Yeah, I just want to say one or two things about the logistics of the lunch break, if I may. First of all, I think it's important to say that the presentations we've had today are really important, but as, I'm not sure if anyone was really meaning that, but to suggest that what we've had in the last 2 hours is the beginning and the end of the issue is not the case. Our speakers are setting out certain contexts, leading on to some other issues that Robin is going to touch on, particularly this afternoon, which is the discussion here, the electorate in relation to F2, and that whole relationship. I think that's absolutely crucial, and that's what we're going to go to this afternoon. And one other reflection before I get into the logistics of the lunch. I'm a trade unionist, and there's one of the radical Democrat candidates has got a T-shirt, and it says, unions, you're either at the table or you're on the table. And having discussions like this means that you, SNP members and other interested parties, are at the table. And some of those discussions are going to be controversial, possibly even difficult. But it's important that we have those discussions. And I think this morning we had that. The logistics around the lunch, unfortunately, the cafe downstairs is not open. We were hoping that it was going to be open. It's not open. So our cunning plans for lunch, sandwich, blah blah, up here isn't going to work. But there are many places round about here within 5 minutes, walking distance, where you'll be able to get a sandwich and a coffee, bring it back here, and then hopefully we'll get started timorously this afternoon and continue the discourse that we had this morning, but Robin laying out some of those parameters about where we are and where the Scottish public are in relation to independence. But as a final point this morning, I would like to thank our contributors, our speakers and Isabel for chairing this morning's session. Thank you. There's marks for casting lines going up here. Oh,